It's about how languages are learned by Lightbound and Spada. And this week we will discuss chapter two. And the reason we decided not to discuss chapter one because we already discussed all the topics in chapter one in the second part of the course. So I would recommend you to skim it and let me know if you have any question in the discussion. But this week we will discuss right to the second part of the course, which about the second language learning. In today's lecture, we're going to talk more about the context, the different contexts that we have for first language learning and second language learning. And we're going to discuss in more details how we're going to study the second language learning and what are the tools, what are the methods that we're going to depend on to explore the second language learning. And also, we're going to tap into one of the most important concepts in language learning, which is the idea of developmental sequences or developmental stages in different areas in language acquisition and processing, with some focus on syntactic and morphological features. So, first language acquisition and second language acquisition have a lot in common, but also they have their own peculiar aspects. So, one of the aspects, if you look at the differences that we have for each type of learner in the two processes, so for example, when it comes to cognitive maturity, young children are capable of acquiring language incidentally without instruction. And that's why we see throughout the first 5 years of their age, they kind of like being absorbent of the language and they develop the language system quite in a very interesting way. The older learner can draw on problem solving meta-linguistic ability that they bring to the language acquisition process. So here, the second language or the young language learner, especially in the field of second language, they have a lot of cognitive maturity compared to the children. So they depend on all the meta-linguistic, the knowledge that they have, especially from the first language that they already have in place. And they are going to depend on more of the skills that they have in order to help them navigate through the second language learning process. Another thing that is quite different between the learner characteristics in child language acquisition and second language learner is the idea of attitudinal aspects between them. So, attitudinal aspects, one of the things that we might highlight here is the idea of anxiety. Like adults, when they are learning a second language, are more anxious about making errors because a lot of psychological factors are involved when it comes to practicing this language, which doesn't exist in the child language learning process. So a lot of people, when they are starting to learn, let's say, for example, a second language or a third language, and they are just like an adult, they care about their self-image, they are so conservant about making mistakes. And that's why this factor is in place when they start learning the language. While in fact, when we were discussing how the child learned the language, they don't care about mistakes. They all the time make mistakes, and we're not judging them, which is not the case in a young adult learning a second language or a second language learner context. Another thing that also quite different in the two contexts is the conditions in the two processes. So young learners are allowed to be silent. And as we said, it takes them almost 12 months to produce the first word, while older learner or second language learner are pressured to speak. You're speaking the language for a reason, or you're trying to learn the language for a reason. Maybe it's a job, maybe for communication, maybe for traveling. So all the time, whenever you are like pushing yourself to learn a language, there is a purpose of learning this language, and they're using it on the spot. So this factor, being pressured to speak, not to be silent all the time, not to be receiving, not to be building your perception skills, but more of the production skills that are always in demand when you learn a new language. Another thing related to the condition is the time. So for the younger learner, they typically have more time to learn. And that's why we said where they go through different stages when it comes to language learning. They go through the one word stage and then the whole phrases and then the three-word stage, or maybe the initial stages of combining words together and then making mistakes. It's totally fine. But when it comes to young second language learner, the case is totally different, because in this case they are having less time of exposure to the language, especially if you're learning it in a constrained condition like inside or outside the classroom. Let's say, for example, now you're trying to learn Chinese. So you have limited exposure to the language, and you are practicing this language inside a very like timed context. A third factor is the idea of the type of language. So the feedback that you're receiving all the time when you are a second language learner is different from the feedback that you are receiving as a child learning their first language. A fourth thing is the idea of exposure to a modified input. As we mentioned in the first part of the course, that children are exposed to child-directed speech. It's a simpler version of speech. It's a very simple, it's very concise, and it's more concrete than being abstract. Also, the second language learner are exposed to a modified version of input, which is the foreigner talk or the teacher talk. So both of them are quite similar in this part because both of them are exposed to some kind of modified input. So when it comes to study the language learner or the second language learner, how we can know more about their language. In a child language acquisition, we discuss different methods and different ways, especially ingenious ways of collecting data, because it was so hard to elicit language from people, from children who don't have this faculty yet. But when it comes to second language learner, they already have the language. And one of the and I would say it's a quite less challenging to examine second language learner compared to child language learner, to the child learning a first language. So when it comes to the second language learning, we all the time depend on observing their language production and describing it or even analyzing it. And we're trying to find the different stages they go through. Like, do we have the one word stage? Do we have the hollow phrases? Do we have the categorical perception? Do we have how they handle the Gavagai problem and all of these issues that's happening when you are learning a new language? And do we have some kind of development or it's incorrect version of the language that they start producing? And also, we want to know how does the L1 knowledge, because now we are talking about learner who already have a linguistic system in place and they are trying to add another linguistic system. And as we mentioned in the first part, the idea of the innate mechanism and the idea of the critical period hypothesis, how all of this factor in the second language acquisition. So one of the methods that is widely used in exploring second language learner is the idea of contrastive analysis, which is basically based on analyzing the differences between the first language that they already have access to and the second language that they are aiming to learn. And the reason that this contrastive analysis approach is uh, is helpful is that it tries to predict problematic areas where transfer is likely to occur. So let's say, for example, I don't know how to combine a sentence in the new language. So in this case, it is likely that you will use your knowledge of the first language to help you fill the gap that you have in the second language knowledge. And this method has some limitations. It ended up over predicting errors. So based on these two languages, let's say, for example, I speak English and I'm trying to learn Chinese, or I'm a speaker of English and I'm trying to learn Spanish. So here we're predicting this based on a lot of factors, and we're going to discuss this, especially if languages have a lot in common. It's way easier that we have a lot of transfer happening. And when language don't have a lot of common, transfer is also is likely to happen, but with less confidence, I would say. And that's why the one of the issues that we have with this method is the idea of the idea of over predicted errors or under predicted errors. So one of the things that also we need to highlight is the idea that not all errors are bidirectional. So let's say, for example, I have two learners. One is a speaker of English and is trying to learn Chinese, and another is a Chinese person trying to learn English. So do we have this direct bi-directional kind of error prediction, or is it happening in one direction? Only when you are speaker of English learning Chinese, not when you are speaker of Chinese learning English. And another issue is that this method doesn't account for developmental errors. It also highlights like prediction in the idea of behavioristic approach to the language learning. So if you're speaking this language, there is a higher possibility or probability that you are making these mistakes, or lower probability. Another approach that is used is the error analysis. And instead of predicting what the learner are going to stumble upon, Richard, 1974, introduced another method saying that we can analyze the errors that are actually made by the language learner. So we start with the errors, not the prediction, and we try to understand why they are made. Maybe with reference to second language that they are targeting to learn, or the first language, or any other factors. And in this way, it's more of descriptive and it looks for pattern in learner language. However, it still has also some limitations. First of all, it doesn't account for learner strategy such as error avoidance, as Statute 1947 74, sorry, highlighted. And the idea of error avoidance, like when you are a speaker of, let's say, for example, a language X, and you're trying to learn Chinese or you're trying to learn Italian or Arabic, let's say, in this case, what is happening, if you feel like you are making a mistake at some point, you're avoiding it. Maybe because the context, maybe you don't like to be judged, maybe because you're giving public speech. A lot of factors are involved. As we said earlier, the idea of attitudinal approach to the language learning. Or let's say, for example, if I'm going to make mistake pronouncing a word, I'm trying to avoid it to find an equivalent or a synonymous item that is way simpler for me to pronounce. So whatever we're saying, like analyzing the errors, it's not reliant, it's not valid in this case. And that's why that's one of the limitations, that having this accurate analysis of errors is not reflecting the competence level of the learner. Because we focus only on errors, and this approach, therefore, may miss evidence of progress. Slinker 1972 introduced one of the, like I would say, one of the most important concept in language learning, and it makes perfect sense for me as a multilingual speaker. So interlanguage, for example, is the idea of, the initial stages of learning a language. Think of it as the child level of learning a language. It's more of a developing version of you learning the language. So, in your initial stages of learning a new language, you might sound funny because you have a lot of gaps. You're making a lot of transfer from your first language. That's your interlanguage. Because in this case, you're still developing your second language knowledge. And the analysis of the interlanguage process that we go through in our journey of learning a second language have found some features. This stage of language learning is systematic and it's rule governed. And also, it is dynamic because it's evolving all the time. Whenever you're getting feedback, whenever you are reading about something, whenever you are learning the right pronunciation of a word, you're fixing it. That's why it's developing all the time. However, it reaches some stage, it's just like a dead end. That's the fossilization stage. And if you want to understand the word, the concept fossilization, it's just like every single day we are being exposed to some form of fossilization, especially with the second language learner. So maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in your community, you've seen people who have been in the country for like 20 years, but they are still having the accent, or they are making the same like mistakes over and over and over, especially like syntactic mistakes or morphological mistakes. And that's the idea of fossilization. Like at some point, this developmental change stops. The features of language, the target language, are not developing, are not refined. So let's say, for example, I spent 10 years in Italy, and after 10 years, I couldn't or I am not yet able to get the accent, or I'm still making some errors when it comes to conjugating the verbs in Italian. So that's the idea of fossilization. And there is also another reason for that. Remember when we discussed the critical period hypothesis? At some stages, this innate language mechanism, if we're going to borrow some of the concepts from the nativist approach, it shuts down, right? And in this case, the fossilization is just like his head. When some language feature stop changing. However, one of the things that we also need to keep in mind when we're studying the second language learner process is the idea of developmental sequences. Pineman 1988 find out that second language learner do go through developmental sequences. They are just like the first language learning process. It goes through different stages. Maybe not exactly the one we mentioned in child language acquisition process of one word or waiting for like 12 months to produce the first word, but they do pass through developmental stages. And the second language sequences are similar to first language sequences and similar in second language learner with different first language backgrounds. And the initial evidence for second language sequences came from learner whose primary learning environment was outside the classroom. And even in classroom, they have revealed similar developmental patterns. One of the things that have been highlighted as well are the grammatical morphemes. And as we mentioned in the first part of the course, that morphology is one of the levels of the language. So the second language order for the acquisition of the grammatical morphemes is similar, but not identical to first language order. The way the child acquires the morphological morpheme or the grammatical morphemes is quite similar to the processes or the different stages of process or the learning process that the second language go through. Even some aspects of second language order are common across learners with different linguistic backgrounds. However, there is some evidence also of the influence of the first language. And there are some like reasons why do we have the same order of acquiring the grammatical morphemes. Some of them, as has been discussed in the chapter, the salience, the linguistic complexity, and the semantic transparency, and similarity to first language form and frequency in the input. So one of the features that highlights how the process of second language learning is being described, analyzed, and observed are the developmental stages. So we're going to see for example, here, how the negation is being developed in a second language learner process. So it goes through some stages. For example, in the first stage, what happens is the negative element is added before the verb. And the simple negative or negating particle here is no. So, no bicycle, or I no like it. And then they move on. Remember, again, it's a developmental sequences. The second stage, there is some kind of improvement. So they already have in their stock, on the linguistic second language stock, the no and the no part. And in this case, they add a new particle, which is the not. And in this case, they might alternate between no and not in their uh, output, in their utterances. So, however, in this stage, like don't is not marked for person. Like we all the time it's don't. Like he don't like it instead of he doesn't like it or they don't like it. So don't occurs with all of them, not being marked for person or number or tense, and may be used before a modal. Like you might see words like I don't can play that or I don't can sing. The next stage wherein we can see placing the negative elements after auxiliary verbs. So the don't form is not yet fully analyzed, but you can see example or sentences like you can go there, or they don't like rice, or she don't like rice. Sorry. So here, what we can see here is we already have the negative element. It's not marked yet, but it's there in the right place. And not here has been used and added to the modal verb. The next stage, which is stage 4, we start to see that the negative element is being marked for tense, person, and number. So you're gonna see utterances like it doesn't work or we didn't have supper. So it doesn't work. Here we're having the negative elements is being marked for the person. Here it's being marked for the tense in the past. And also some learner continue to mark the verb as well as the auxiliary, and it didn't went there at this stage. Instead of saying I didn't go there, but at least they ended up using the right negative element marked for the tense. But still, we're having the main verb is being conjugated to agree with the tense, which is not correct. Forming questions is also another area that shows the developmental sequences. So, stage 1, when the second language learner started to formulate question, they might have a single word or formula or sentence fragment. Like they might use the word dog, like dog or table. We don't have like a full form of the question, but we have the most important word that they want to ask the question about. Or they might depend on some formulas that they have been exposed to or they have been instructed to use when they are asking about something and they know this formula. Think of this formula as the hollow phrases that we discussed in the child language development. So that's a formula or sentence fragment. In the second stage, we start to see some declarative word order without having the interrogative form of the question. So you might have like rising intonation at the end, like it's a monster in the right corner, just like if you're asking yes no question with the rising intonation. Or the boy threw the shoes. So we don't have here an interrogative form, but we still have a declarative word order with some intonational feature indicating questions. Stage 3 shows some kind of fronting, like the initial stages of forming a question. And that's why we start to see a question word. And this question word might be a yes no question word, like a modal word that have been foregrounded or fronted to the beginning to mark the question form, or a WH word. So that's why, for example, here, does in this picture there is for astronauts, or where the children are playing. So here we don't have a fully formed in a correct way the question form, but we have the initial stages of forming a question, which is the idea of fronting here. In stage 4, what happens is it's quite more progress and development in the question forming, and we start to see some inversion in the WH copula in, for example, the yes no question. So here we started to see the is inverted with the subject here. So instead of saying where the sun is, as we saw in stage 3, we started to see where is the sun. And then instead of saying um, is there a fish is in the water, as we saw in the previous stage, we can see here the inversion is happening. So the copula here is inverted to be in the very beginning before the subject. Stage 5 indicates more developed improvement, and inversion with the WH question is happening with both the auxiliary verb and the main verb. And that's why you start to see the WH word, the how here, how do. Both of them are happening together. Remember what happened in stage 3, like it's only one of them that was there. Or what's the boy doing? So now we start to see good question form with fronting happening and also inversion happening. Stage 5, which is the most advanced stage, we start to see the emergence of complex questions. For example, tag questions, negative questions, or even embedded questions. Another area of language acquisition that indicates the developmental stages or developmental sequences is acquiring or learning possessive determiners. So in pre-stage or in stage 1, the pre-emergence of these possessive determiners like my, mine, his, her, your. So in possessive determiners, in stage 1, we don't see any use of his, her, your. For example, one of them is used with all persons, all genders, and all numbers. In second stage, we start to see the emergence of these individual possessive determiners. So we started to see his and or her without distinguishing them. So you might hear utterances or sentences like the girl making herself beautiful. She put the makeup on his hand. The mother is dressing her little boy. She put on her clothes, her pants, her coat. So here we have some kind of possessive determiner. Maybe not the right one, but here they are there. And the next stage, you might see some differentiated use of his and her. So, for example, the girl fell on her bike and she looked her father and cried. So you see here the emergence or the post-emergence of the possessive determiner. And in this case, one of them is right, the other one is still developing. So that's a kind of developmental errors. They are indicating some kind of development, the emergence of this or the command of this possessive determinant. The final stage, it's just like the most advanced stage, which is the error-free stage of using the possessive determinant. So now, including natural gender and body parts, all of them are being used, as in this example. The little girl with her dad play together, and the dad take his girl on his shoulder and he hurt his back. So see here, the possessive determiner is referring back to he, possessive determiner, still dad, referring back to the dad, and the possessive determiner, of course, to the dad. And here we see the dad, and then the her here, the possessive determiner is referring back to the girl. Another area that also shows the acquisition process and the developmental or errors or the developmental sequences of second language learning is relative clauses. And Kanan and Comray, 1977, highlighted that the second language ability to understand and produce relative clauses develop in sequence, reflected in the accessibility hierarchy. So if learner can produce sentence using relative clauses that are lower on the list, they can produce those above that one. As we will see in the next slide, we have different relative clauses in one list. So it depends which one you acquire, which one you command. And whenever you're going down, it means you are having the command of all of them. For example, learner who can produce a relative clause for the object of a preposition can also produce one for the subject, one for the direct and indirect objects. So here, if you look at this, we're having this accessibility hierarchy that he discussed in his study, and he said, for example, here the relative clause relates to the subject. So that's the man. The man here is the subject, right? So the man, who's the man who ran away? So here, the relative clause, starting with who, is referring back to the man, the subject in this case. And that's why we're using a subject relative clause or a subject relative pronoun, sorry. And we can also use the relative clause to elaborate on the direct object in a sentence. So that is the truck that I sold yesterday. So in this sentence, that is not the subject. Why? Because we already have the subject here. I sold yesterday. So in this case, it's an object. It's an object relative pronoun. So now we're having direct object, and that's relative clause related to that. Also, it can be used to indirect object. So that's the man to whom, that's the indirect pronoun. I, subject, gave the letter, direct object. Also, we can use that for an objective of preposition. So that's the book that I told you about. So that's the object of a preposition. Also, you can refer to position when using the genitive pronoun here. That's the man whose sister I know. Also, you can use it as an object of comparison, sorry. Here's the only man whom I'm taller than. So here we're having the comparison part. We're having the genitive part or having the preposition part. So, according to the study conducted by Kinnan and Comrie in 1977, that the learner ability to understand and produce relative clauses develops in a sequence, meaning the learner who can produce a relative clause for the object of a preposition can produce one for the subject and the other for the direct and the indirect object. Meaning, if learner can produce sentences using relative clauses that are lower in the list, this one, they are able to produce the one that are here. So these are less accessible, these are more accessible. So if they are going here, it means we're having more developmental stages are emerging in acquiring the relative clauses. Another thing that also we need to consider when we are describing or observing or even analyzing the relative clauses produced by the learner is the idea of the first language impact, the influence of their first language, and the idea of transferring from their first language. So the first language influence, if learner's first language doesn't have a particular clause type, it's more difficult for them to learn that type in English. And also where first language has a different way of forming their relative clauses, learner might avoid using them even when their second language is fairly advanced. So, for example, in this sentence, the man that I saw him was very tall. And it's easy to spot why this sentence is problematic because we're having here the relative clause of a direct object, and then we're having a pronoun referring back to the same relative pronoun. So that's an impact of the influence of the first language. That's a transferring from the first language. And I have taught a lot of students from different linguistic backgrounds, and I can tell how the transference is happening, especially in when I'm teaching them writing, or when they are having a speaking class, or when we're having like more of communication kind of context. All of this transference is easily spotted. Also, another area that might indicate the developmental stages is the idea of referring back to the past, or even it shows some part of the first language impact. So, beginning, learner with very limited language may simply refer to events in the order in which they occurred, or mention a time or place to show that the event occurred in the past. So you might see something like, my son come, he work in restaurant. January, now we're having the time reference, January, it's very cold. Now we're in March, let's say, but they say January, and it's an indicator to you to know that they are referring to something back in time. Or Vietnam, we work too hard, like the war of Vietnam. And that's why they are referring back, they are using one word or one time point that indicates to you that they are referring to some past action or past event or a past point in time. Later in their developmental stages, they might start to attach a grammatical morpheme which shows that the verb is marked for the past. So you might see the ed or the past participle or the en, like taken or talked. Like here, for example, in this example, the people worked in the field. However, that might also include some kind of overgeneralization or overextension of a language rule, and you start to like attach ed to all the verbs. So you might hear words like catched, or you might see words like drinked water or rided her bicycle. And an interesting thing that learners are more likely to mark past tense on some verbs than others. And that reminds us back of the child language acquisition process that we discussed. The idea of overextension or the idea of overgeneralization that happened, and the idea of transitivity bias and all of the things that we discussed in the first part of the course. And the reason that they might ended up marking some past tense on some verbs than others might be ascribed to the idea of lexical aspects of different verbs. So they might ended up using the past tense for specific events that mark completeness, like I broke something or my sister fixed it with the glue, let's say, for example, than when they're referring to states or activities, which may last for extended period without a clear point, a clear end point. She seemed happy last week, or my father belonged to a club. So the moving through the different developmental sequences in the second language learning is something that we need to understand as not like closed rooms, meaning you're leaving one, you're just like leaving it behind. It's a more of emergence of a new form, then increasing frequency of uses. So the progress to a higher stage can result in new errors or a different kind of errors. Like you might see words like or utterances like he ran out the door, followed by he ran out the door. So developmental progress as well interacts with first language impact or influence. And also the second language learning is always interacting with the first language. It's hard to just like to shut it down the first system that you already have access to when you are speaking the second language. Maybe because you have a lot of linguistic gaps, maybe because they have a lot in common, maybe because a lot of other factors. It's easier to say it that way, or even because we have same sentence, same words that have similar meaning, or maybe like a lot of factors that might be enticing you to refer or depend on the first language. Cross-linguistic influence can promote also, that's a good thing because it can promote your second language development. Because in this case, you don't have to learn everything. So in this case, learners draw on what they already know from the first language or previously learned languages if they are like uh, speaking more than one language. And also the impact of the first language system might impact the developmental stages. So Some studies highlighted that learners may linger longer in a developmental stage because of the impact or the influence of their first language. For example, pre-verbal no in negation is so popular that the Spanish first language speaker linger more, like linger longer in their developmental stages in this form than speaker from a different linguistic background. And also another thing that the influence of the first language that learner may also avoid the use of some second language correct feature that are similar to their first language because they maybe wish to avoid making mistakes that might caused by the first language pattern. And another thing, and that's very interesting, it's easier for learner to acquire a new second language feature that doesn't exist in their first language than to stop using a feature that is present in their first language, but not in their second language. As mentioned in the book, the idea of the adverb placement in French and in English, and where the adverb should go in the sentence, and the different places that it goes into within the sentence. So that's a very interesting feature, especially when you are learning a second language or a third language. You will find this a lot. Like it's way easier to acquire a grammatical feature or a linguistic aspect that is not there in your first language because you don't have any friction, you don't have any tension between the first system and the second system. And remember again, the flexibility of the mind or the part in the brain that is responsible for the language has already been shaped by the first language. That's why when you are entering a new system, all the time the impact of the first system is there. And it's just like so relieving when you know that this part is not there in the first system. And in this case, less friction from for the second system to be absorbed and being already installed and being ready to be in use. Also, translanguaging, wherein that's like learner benefit from opportunity to draw on their linguistic resources. So using L1 allows learner to express their thoughts more fully, and using parts of them help them to build a new multilinguistic, multilingual competence. Vocabulary is also another area of language or another level of the language that we discussed in child language acquisition. And here we have some facts about the different stages that one goes through as learning the language. So the English language is estimated to have like between 100,000 to 1 million words, and everyday conversation requires around 2,000 words. And the educated speaker of English knows around 20,000 words. So, second language vocabulary learning is different from first language vocabulary acquisition. Why? Because as we said, in first language acquisition, we're having more exposure and more helpful context, especially with concrete aspects. Remember when we discussed the idea of a child-directed speech, like we're using the here and now aspects. But in second language acquisition, it's quite different because we don't have a lot of exposure to the term, and we don't have a lot of contextual cues that help us understand the meaning of the new lexical items. So guessing the meaning of a new word in context require more than 90% of the words already in the text. And that's why it's so hard, because you will not be able to decode or unpack the meaning of a word unless you know the other words in the text, because you cannot keep guessing all of them to make out the meaning. Also, there are some factors that make second language words easier. One of them is exposure in meaningful context, noticing, of course. And in noticing, it's the idea of to identify a new word, to be aware of this new word, and to start to uptake this word, to start to add it to your system. And noticing, it's a cognitive skill, and it has two stages, like being aware of this new word and then start to use it. So let's say, for example, and that's a very interesting point. Noticing might start like in a silent way. Like one of the big names in language, a second language acquisition is Stephen Krashen. And I would recommend all of you guys to read some of his works. He's just like so interesting and so intriguing when it comes to second language theories and second language acquisition. And he highlighted the idea that maybe we are exposed to the word. Let's say, for example, I'm learning Italian. I might ended up reading a short story for beginners in Italian. And that's why I start to notice, oh, that's a verb, right? In this context, that's a verb. Maybe it means this. So these are the initial stages of observing a word. And then maybe if you are moving on and reading the next page and you start to see the same word again. Now you have some initial noticing of it, but the exposure, more exposure, frequency of exposure is just like helping you to retain this word for longer a period of time and using it in your language utterances. And another factor that might help is the international vocabularies, which are just like everyone knows. Like, let's say, for example, if you're learning Spanish, if you're learning Japanese, if you're learning Italian, Arabic, or any other language, they are the same, like dollar or sushi. That's an international, maybe international uh, brand name, international item, currency, whatever it is. That's way easier. Like whenever you're saying dollar, everyone knows. It doesn't matter with whether you're saying it in Spanish or English. It's easily decoded. You can easily catch it. Maybe with different pronunciation. Let's say, for example, the word pizza. You might ended up, let's say, for example, learning some Arabic or some French, and you might see people saying pizza. So, but you can see the word, you can understand the word. And the cognate is also another factor. The cognate are words that have like the same origin or they have quite same meaning. Like, for example, music or music. I don't have to read more about the definition of music because I can guess it means music, right? But also we have to be aware of the false cognate. So also you might depend on the non-structural resources, for example, reading for pleasure. And I'm going to stop here and say something very interesting. If you are interested to read more about the reading for pleasure and for learning, also I would recommend Stephen Krashen because he introduces this, I would say, most interesting learning approach, which he called the silent reading. And you can just like Google it, and you'll find a lot of fascinating research on this approach. In this case, you're not your focus when you're reading it's a silent reading. You're reading for pleasure, you're enjoying the story, but at the same time your eyes, let's say, are exposed to words in this target language. So keep reading any kind of reading, like social posts or reading comics or reading anything, comic books or anything. And also, you can get some vocab from the digital media, TV or gaming. Unlike the children, remember, they have limited gain from watching TV. But in your case, you have this cognitive maturity as a second language learner, so you can catch a lot of words from this. However, we also should be aware, as we also highlighted some parts of this in the child language learning, some research shows that vocabulary development is facilitated when learners focus attention on new words and use them in productive tasks. So that's why all the time, I remember when I was learning a new language, I guess it was German, and oh my God, it was so hard when just like the pronunciation, the words, and that's why I stopped learning that language and I started to practice or start to learn some Spanish instead because it was way easier for me because I was doing some study on the contrastive analysis, how it was a grammatical aspect feature wherein how different languages are using the subject verb object order thing. So one of the things that you will, let's say for example I'm reading, so what happens is you will take notes about this is a new word, let's say you're writing it down and you start to use it in telling a story or you start to use it in your next time using this language with a friend of yours who is a native speaker of this language. You're trying to squeeze it in any context, you're trying to use it, even like one of the saying that says use it or lose it, that's kind of thing, like try to use it in more productive tasks. And second language vocabulary learning requires effort by learners and teachers as well, because we need a lot of noticing, we need a lot of being aware, we need to be aware of its meaning, its form, its pronunciation, and also its use. And one of the technique I used when I'm learning a new language, and especially in building up my vocabulary stock, is just like to know the word, first thing, to know its meaning, pronunciation, then its form, and then its use. Some people might say, okay, the use, the meaning and the use are kind of like have the same thing. So it's meaning all the time. Start with the meaning, pronunciation, especially if the language is just like having a stress and intonation, or a tonic language like Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. So that's something also you need to keep in mind. Another area that shows some kind of developmental order or developmental stages is the idea of pragmatics. And in pragmatics, we touched upon this very quickly in the first part of the course, and we said pragmatics is the language in use. It's the ability to use language appropriately, knowing how to use it, when to use it, and its intentional meaning, not only the form, the literal meaning, but more of the situational meaning or the social meaning. So if you're apologizing, you know how to do that politely, and also, if you're refusing or disagreeing or expressing difference or respect, you recognize the meanings of the same sentence in different contexts. Like, for example, this sentence might have different meaning in different contexts. So let's say, for example, I found a dog and I'm asking you who is, when you're passing by, say, is that your dog? It means, are you the owner of this dog in this context? Or if you're walking your dog, I'm saying, is that your dog? That's the meaning here is different. Or even another interesting example is thank you. Like you might say it with different tones and it has different meaning. Like thank you, I mean it. Or thank you. Or So here we're having the meaning based on the context. Learner with advanced second language grammatical and lexical knowledge might have difficulty using language appropriately in some context. And that's very true, like especially because the social or the contextual meaning is quite like implicit and more challenging to advanced language learner. That's why you see, what do you mean? And all of these kind of questions when you are interacting with non-native speakers. Some aspects of pragmatics are also acquired developmentally, especially requests. For example, in stage one, you might see highly contextual, context dependent, uh, no syntax, and no relational goals, like me new blue and me new blues or something like that. In the second stage, you might find some formula-like aspects, something that they already maybe memorized, have been introduced to, and they're using it as a bulk or as a chunk. Like, let's play the game. Don't look. So here we're having reliance or unanalyzed formulas or imperative. And then the next stage, we might see unpacking. So formulas incorporated into productive language use. Shift to conventional indirectness. You might see, can you pass the pencil, please? Instead of just like, you know, passing, pass the salt or the pencil. Or can you do me another one? Can you do another one for me? Stage four, you might see more of expansion and the introduction of new forms and increased use of mitigating the request form and more complex syntactic pattern. Like, could I have another chocolate because my children, I have 5 children? Or can I see it so I can copy it? So here we're having more syntactic, uh, like more complex syntactic forms, and also we're having mitigation. I have children, and so I can copy it. In stage five, we can see more advanced stages that they can command. So we're having more of fine tuning. And in this area, the second language learner is fine tuning the requisitive force to participants' goals or context. So, for example, you could put some blue tack down there, or are there any more white? So, researcher indicates that learner benefit from instruction in pragmatics, and that's very helpful because there are some research that says pragmatics cannot be taught or cannot be just like having this structural environment to be acquired by the second language learner. While the research highlighted no, it is something that can be instructed, can be taught in structural context. And this is good news for second language learner who don't have extensive exposure to conversational interaction outside the classroom. Pronunciation as well is one of the areas that have a lot of challenges, especially like accents, intonation, especially when first and second language do not belong to the same language family, like not Latin or Slavic or Semitic languages. They don't have a lot in common. So let's say, for example, if you are speaker of Arabic and you're learning English, or if you're a speaker of Arabic and you're learning let's say, for example, Slavic like Ukrainian or the Russian language. So, learning to perceive differences in second language sounds takes time and focus. And that is very true. And the greater differences between first language and second language can lead to greater pronunciation difficulties. And one of the example mentioned in the book is the Japanese speaker trying differentiate between L and R because they don't have these sounds in their languages, or they are not as clear as they are in English. And even like the different phonemes or allophones of L, for example, in English, or having clear L, like the word clear, the pronunciation of the L is different from school or cool, like the L in the two contexts is pronounced differently. So longer period of exposure lead to improved pronunciation. And that's good news. And adults who continue to make greater use of their first language have stronger accent in the second language. And the ethnic affiliation identity choices also contribute to pronunciation development. Interestingly, when learners focus primarily on meaning, they may not be able to also pay attention to the sounds of the words. And the people who are speaking more than one language, it resonates with them because at some point you're focusing too much on the meaning, the content, not the form. And the good news is instruction is beneficial, particularly if it focuses on suprasegmental features rather than segmental feature pronunciation. Suprasegmental feature, the idea of intonation or the idea of combining, blending words together, and instead of focusing too much on individual phonemes or individual consonant cluster. One thing that is very common in the second language learning research is the goal of being a good speaker of the second language is measured or evaluated based on how my accent is. Is it more of native like or not native like? One thing that Salthover 2011 highlighted is there are many different native speaker varieties. Like if you're learning English, which version of English? Even nowadays, in today's world, we don't have one English. We have Englishes. We're having American English. We're having British English, Australian English, South African English, maybe Canadian English. So we're having international and regional variety of English that are appropriate for second language learner to model. And the priority is to be intelligible and communicatively competent, not to sound like a native speaker. As long as you're making sense, as long as you're being understood, you are a good second language learner. And research shows that the presence of a strong foreign accent doesn't necessarily result in a reduced intelligibility or comprehensibility. However, even perfectly intelligible second language speaker may experience some discrimination related to their perceived accent. In fact, there are many accent reduction businesses and accent modification services whose ethics have been questioned. And if you're interested in this, a lot of them are out there online. You can just like refer back to Darwin and Monroe 2015. And also, sampling language, learner language. Like one of the things that highlight us to understand more about the nature of the second language learner, if if we can analyze authentic speeches, not artificial ones. Like we're listening to the second language learner, we're reading their writing, we're seeing them in intercultural communication. So corpus linguistics emphasizes the analysis of authentic spoken and written texts. So developing teaching material that reflect how language is used in the community, not how it should be used. And also documented language use rather than hypotheses about what users might say or write. So, in conclusion, the language the second language learner produce and understand changes as they gain more exposure to the second language and use it in a variety of situations. As we've seen in the different developmental stages that the second language learner go through in picking up or acquiring different aspects of the language, as we've noticed in acquiring questions, negations, relative clauses, or even determiners, or pragmatics, or even pronunciation. And there are strong patterns of similarity across learners of different ages, learning in different contexts, and learning from different first language background. So this chapter has focused primarily on similarities, but there are some differences in the rate and the ultimate success of learning due to the individual variation. And we will discuss this in the next chapter next week. So,